Good evening. My name is Thea Keith-Lucas, and together with my colleague Trish Weinman, I coordinate Radius, which promotes ethical reflection on issues in science and technology here at MIT. It is our great honor to host the J. Herbert Holloman Memorial Symposium, which pays homage to a distinguished scientist and his particular love for a lively debate. Herb's friends and family give us a wonderfully open-ended charge. Start a conversation about an issue that matters. We're grateful to the Holloman Symposium Committee, and especially Dr. Jake Jacoby, for all their efforts to choose a great question and get the right people into the room. We will begin with a few words from George Heaton, a professor at Worcester Polytechnic and one of the many people who benefited from Herb Holloman's mentorship. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Thea. I think I'll start with a question. How many here knew Herb Holloman in the flesh? I've got you on one hand. So that means I have the enviable task of enlightening the others of you about this man who was responsible not only for the symposium, but also, frankly, I think perhaps more than anyone else, for putting issues such as this today, which is the relationship between technology and society, on the national policy map. This is an enviable task, but Thea has given me 5 minutes. Herb was marked by a unique intelligence, drive, and vision. And yet, as you can see from his bio, in his early life at MIT, he went through the place rather slowly. He was called away to military service, in particular to the Watertown Arsenal, where, as he put it, his job was to make better cannonballs faster than the Germans did. And what he saw was this constant change in technology that he had to keep up with, we had to keep up with for our salvation. But while he was in MIT, he went through fast. There is the story about Herb and Richard Feynman. Yes, Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize winner in physics, were ejected from their physics class. They had special needs because they just got it so much quicker than everybody else. In midlife, as you can see, Herb managed the great research lab at the General Electric Company in New York State, which was a kind of paradigm for the corporate research labs of that era. Herb always said that he made the mistake of staying there way too long. But it did put him in the literary canon. He appears in one of Kurt Vonnegut's novels because Kurt's brother, Bernie, was the GE corporate historian. Toward the end of his life, as the bio says, Herb was devastated by a stroke. And after that, as Herb was recovering, he and I went across the river to Boston University and met with President Silber to talk about forming a new research center. Silber, ever confrontational, began with, "Holloman, I'm here to see what you've got left of your mind." And Herb said, "Well, John, they tell me that my mind was so good that I could lose a chunk of it and still start your research center." We did. The most important thing Herb did, I believe, from our perspective here today, was to invent civilian technology policy. Now, unless that seems an overstatement, think of Eisenhower's warning to the country at the end of his term, saying that a military-industrial complex was taking us over. And so, at the beginning of the JFK era, Jerry Wiesner, later the president of MIT, went to Washington, D.C. to be Kennedy's science advisor, and he in turn invited Herb to come to town and become the first Assistant Secretary for Science and Technology in the Commerce Department. Commerce had always been, as Herb said, the weak sister in the government. And yet, it had an extraordinarily broad portfolio just waiting to be enlivened and strengthened. So Herb set out to make it the center for civilian technology policy. He started a variety of acronyms. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which gives us weather every day, was one of them. NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which made our automobiles safe, was another. FEPCA, which is the Federal Environmental Pesticide Control Act, authored by Herb and Rachel Carson, who was his employee, is yet another. And then there is the SST, which was one of Herb's babies, and it, as you know, never got off the ground. Besides programs, there was clearly a need at that point to start a national conversation. People simply had not thought about how public policy could promote technology development, nor about the consequences for the public of unfettered technological change. One of the leading forums for this discussion today, the National Academy of Engineering, was Herb's idea. I sometimes wonder what Herb would have thought of the internet, because he left us before the internet fully conquered us. If you Google J. Herbert Holloman today, as I did this morning, you find that the last entry is from last month, and it's a piece from the University of Oklahoma saying, "The ghost of Holloman haunts the place." This was written because there was a new president of the University of Oklahoma, and Herb was one from the 1970s. The author admits that nobody much has heard of Herb today, but he is still haunting the place. One of the most interesting things Herb did at the University of Oklahoma, I think, is to talk. Or more exactly, he talked nonstop, 24/7, to the protesting students in 1970 when the National Guard was at the gates of the university. I think that's why the regents fired him. So I would say to all this, let Herb haunt us here today, or more politely, let Herb's spirit of inquiry and dialogue imbue our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. This year's Holloman Symposium tackles the challenging ethical issues surrounding artificial intelligence and the changing nature of work. We are privileged to have excellent guides for this question. Andrew McAfee, co-founder of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. Thomas Kochan, co-director of the MIT Sloan Institute for Employment Research. Liz Reynolds, co-leader of the MIT Future of Work Initiative. I think we have some excellent collaborators as I say all of those co's. There. Yeah. And moderating our conversation, Lucas Stanchik, a professor of philosophy at Harvard, whose scholarship centers on the ethics of production and labor. So, Dr. McAfee, would you start us off, please?
I'll have an easier time starting us off if I actually have my slides here, which, wait, yes, I do. All right, now we're in business. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I just want to start off by framing the issue by showing some evidence that I've relied on that helps me understand what I think are the broad changes happening in the American workforce and what we can expect to see more of as we move deeper into this era of pretty ridiculous technological progress. So I'm going to start by just trying to give a quick overview of what's going on with jobs and wages in the face of technology. And the short answer is that our workforce is, you hear the word hollowing out, you hear the word polarizing a lot. I think that's accurate. And the reason I think that is we have amazing colleagues at MIT who have demonstrated this pretty clearly to me. So I want to cite some work that my colleague David Otter has done to really characterize what's been happening to the American workforce. And what I want to do is redraw a graph that David has included in a couple of his papers that I found fantastic because it's kind of like a time-lapse picture of what's been happening to the engine of American job creation. And the way to think about this is what David did here was take all the jobs in America in 1979 and then line them up from lowest paid to highest paid. So we're just looking at the spread of jobs in America. And then what he did, which I thought was a brilliant idea, was to kind of play the movie forward and look at what happened to job creation and job loss in years following 1979. So, for example, so line up all the jobs from lowest paid to highest paid, and then, in the middle is that good old-fashioned classic American middle class, which I think a lot of us can agree is a pretty fine achievement for our society and a pretty important thing to have. A large, stable, prosperous middle class is pretty good news for a democracy. And what David then did was draw a picture that looks like this. And this shows what happened to the kind of the market share of jobs from 1979 to 1989. And the way to read this is if the line dips below that x-axis, that means the market share of those kinds of jobs decreased. And when the line goes above that red line, the market share of those jobs increased. Not the raw number, but the market share of those jobs between 79 and 89. So when you draw the picture this way, we were losing those kind of jobs and gaining those kind of jobs over that 10-year period. And for me, this is a pretty happy 10-year period because we were losing comparatively low-paid, lower middle-class jobs, and we were creating middle-class jobs and above during that time. So this was, things were working pretty good for the American job creation engine. And then we can keep drawing this picture forward for later years, and I noticed this picture start to change. So if we go up to 99, you start to see the appearance way down low of job growth of very low-paid jobs. And then you start to see that job loss start to creep upward a little bit. The upper class, the upper middle class, the upper class is still doing pretty well here. Things got pretty weird up to 2007, where essentially the only jobs that we were creating were lousy jobs. We're down there at the low end of the pay range, and we were kind of flattening out, or jobs were kind of going away at every other range. In the most recent years, where we have data, you see the top 10, the top 20% come back a bit, but again, you see just this engine of job creation has downshifted, and we're now creating a lot of, less well-paid, more precarious, fairly lousy, lower middle class and below jobs, and that the engine of where the market share is going away is right there in the middle of those classic American middle class jobs. And the other thing that's going on, the last piece of evidence I want to show, is a graph that I find kind of scary, which is the labor force participation rate of prime age American men. And the labor force participation rate simply means, do you either have a job or are you looking for a job? So the unemployment calculation that we hear only takes people into account if they're looking for work. If they're not looking for work, they fall into this category, people who have just stopped participating in the labor force. And what we see here is this very steady and very big decline in the number of a percentage of prime age American men who are just not in the labor force anymore. They're just on the sidelines of the economy. They haven't aged out. These are still prime age people, but for a bunch of reasons, they're on the sidelines of the economy, and hopefully we can talk about what those reasons are. So that's kind of a picture of what's been happening. I try not to be a gloomy person, but I find more challenges than good news in those pictures so far. And then I think the question that we're all wrestling with is what's likely to happen going forward. And the way I tend to think about that is that the technological progress that we're seeing is going to accelerate the trends that we've just been looking at. Because what I see technology doing in this era of very powerful artificial intelligence is kind of escaping from the box where it's been so far, which is the box of being able to accomplish routine tasks over and over pretty repeatedly. Technology has been better than us human beings at that for a long time, and that's where technology has been put to work in the labor force. What's happening now is that technology is pretty quickly acquiring very different kinds of capabilities. It's no exaggeration to say that throughout all of human history, if you wanted to listen to something like this, to normal human speech, figure out what the person wanted and try to deliver it to them, you had to involve another human being in that work. There was no alternative. There are alternatives to that now. They're already pretty good. They're getting better quite quickly. So when I look at that, I see technology escaping this fairly tight box where it's been playing up until now, and acquiring the ability to understand human speech and natural language, to do better than us at jobs of pattern matching and pattern recognition, and that's going to continue to have a big impact on jobs and wages. What I'm not trying to say is that we're going to face massive technological unemployment in 5 or 10 years. I actually don't think that's the case, and that kind of Luddite view of the world has been wrong for coming on 200 years now. But I do think that the most likely scenario for the future is a continuation and probably an acceleration of the trends that we already see pretty clearly in the workforce. And then I think the question that brought us here tonight is, what are the smart reactions to that? What's the right thing to do in the face of these kinds of trends and this flavor, this type of technological progress that we're seeing? Let me stop there, please. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
So in the graph that you just showed us,
Do you want to come to the microphone so we can hear?
Sure, yeah.
Are you mic'd up?
I think I'm right, but audience should see. Just a very quick follow-up question about the slides that you just gave us. Yeah, in this transition, how do you think about the relative importance of technological change and transformation of the nature of the jobs versus what the globalization aspect and outsourcing that's going on?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. Almost everybody that I talk to agrees that there are kind of two. Yep. The excellent question was, are these trends due to what combination of technological progress and globalization? Right? Is that a fair way to recharacterize it? The answer is, there's a huge debate about this, and the answer very much depends on who you talk to. This is one of those classic cases where a group of economists will look at exactly the same body of evidence and draw radically different conclusions about it, and then argue with each other about it. David's paper, the one that I'm taking this graph from, looks at this question. The conclusion that he and his colleagues came to is that the lion's share of that story is due to tech progress, is due to the automation of routine work. He said his work has included globalization and low-skilled immigration and some other things. He says that's not an important part of the story. The main factor causing these changes is actually technological substitution for routine work. Do we want to take questions now or wait till the remarks are over? Can we wait till the end?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So we'll give our moderator the privilege of asking some follow-up questions, and then we'll take questions from everyone else at the end. Okay. Dr. Kochan, would you continue us?
Thank you. Well, Andy did a great job of summarizing what's happening in the labor markets, so this is really a reverse role. I'm going to talk more about the role of technology. But I want to start by challenging the title that was advertised here, because I don't believe for a moment that humans shouldn't apply. In fact, the theme that I want to develop here is we need to take charge of shaping technology and shaping the future of work simultaneously. If we do that, we'll be able to have some impact on the trends that Andy talked about. And so the question really is, how do we do this? It it starts by saying, let's stop wasting our time on the wild predictions that we see dominating so much of the press about how many jobs are going to be created, how many jobs are going to be lost. They're both, we're going to create and we're going to lose some jobs. But the estimates are really pretty vacuous and wild. And if you ask, as Pew Research did, a group of so-called experts, you get about a 50-50 split. And it's not very useful. What we need to do is to shift the debate to say, well, what can we do to use advancing technologies to influence the future of work, to make it more productive, for sure. There's no guarantee that technology will automatically make work more productive, but also make it more equitable and more inclusive than it is at the moment. Now, there's some good news, and we're going to hear more about that from Liz, and that is the MIT task force that the president and the provost have set up is taking this perspective. It's challenging us here at MIT to be proactive, to look at how we can use emerging technologies to transform human work and what kind of skills then are going to be needed to do that productively so people can thrive in the technology of the future. And then how do we use technology to complement human skills? And then third, how to use our civic foundations, our institutions in society to engage in the kind of dialogue and action and collaboration that will make technology produce a more inclusive and broader shared prosperity. So that's our challenge. That's, I think, where MIT is uniquely positioned to provide some leadership, but it's not, it's easier said than done. So what I want to do is just spend a few minutes on some ideas that I think we will try to develop further as we move forward to do this. So let's start with an overview. I think we have to have a much more integrated strategy that brings the different interest groups together to address these issues. And it starts by making sure that we engage in a definition of what problems we're trying to solve with all this new technology, not leave it to the people who are designing it independent of the people who are going to use it. Secondly, we've got to shift, and I'll say more about this, from the standard approach where somebody, some vendor or some technology expert gets an idea, they sell it to an organization, they start to implement it, and then we start worrying about worker skills. That's the standard approach, but we got to take a much more integrated approach. I'll lay that out. And then third, we've got to train people before the technology comes, because when it occurs, when it comes online, it's too late to retrain the workforce. And then finally, we've got to worry that some people will actually lose jobs, and we better not have another generation of winners and losers like we've had from globalization, or we will pay the consequences in our society. So let's put some meat on those bones. The first thing that we need to do to take a more integrated approach and to get a more proactive approach is to recognize what a lot of people are now already saying, that we've got to shift from a focus on jobs, how many jobs are going away, how many jobs are being created, to the underlying tasks that how people work, because technology is going to have as big an effect on how we work and how we do our work, and how we work together and how we can distribute the tasks, routine and non-routine tasks that might have been in one job may now be shared by a team of workers. If we think about that, and if we think about the job structure and the task structure, we can have more of an impact on shaping how technology can enable good work and can complement good work. And we can use it either on one end of the continuum to just displace workers and to focus on total automation, or to think about how to automate it. Now, to do that, I believe we have to shift to a much more integrated approach. I mentioned this sequential approach, and that's basically, I think, the way most technology, not all, but most technologies are developed today. And I've seen this in industries from early on in the auto industry. And by the way, we see it in the auto industry today. Look at the problems that Tesla has had. Tesla says we're going to automate everything and we're going to get rid of all this human labor and we're going to use all this technology. They just didn't know how to build cars. and they didn't bring the workforce in. General Motors learned that lesson in the 1980s, but it didn't seem to carry forward to these geniuses trying to develop the Tesla Model 3 or whatever the most popular model that they have, and now they're way, way behind. Now they're bringing workers into that process. If we would learn the lesson that Toyota taught us a long time ago, that our colleagues who looked at information technology, Erik Brynjolfsson and colleagues, and more recently that we found the same thing in healthcare, when you bring workers into the process and you bring the engineers and the people who understand how the work is done together, and you start to say, how can we allow workers to participate in helping to design the technologies to make this work more productive, to make it safer, make it easier, make it more satisfying, you get a higher rate of return on that technology and you get better jobs. That's the first step. To do that, though, you've got to have workers who understand the technology. You have to have workers who have been empowered along the line and trained before the technology comes there to the workplace so that they can inform it and they can work with it. So we've got to invest in more continuous training before the technologies are being implemented, engage the workforce, engage the engineers, engage the managers with the vendors to figure out how we adapt it to the specific workplace, and we will get the kind of outcomes that Toyota has gotten, that we see in the best healthcare organizations where they integrate these automated medical record systems with the workforce and the doctors and the nurses and the technicians and the people who are out there in our communities. So there are ways to do this. But it's going to require change, and it's going to require changes in the organizations and in the distribution of power for those who bring this about. I'll just re-emphasize this. We're seeing more and more evidence that the organizations that are able to take a more integrated approach are ones that are what we call in my field high-road employers. They already have a well-trained workforce. They've invested in them before. They've had them engaged in problem-solving techniques, and therefore they can adapt to these new technologies. They can bring their wisdom to these digital opportunities and tools, and you get the best of both worlds. But if we wait and say, gee, we've got to retrain the workforce when the crisis comes, then people are too rigid, they're too stressed, it's too late, it takes too long to develop those skills, and we get the winners and losers situation. So what I think we ultimately have to do, and this is something that I hope we will do on this task force, we can't do it alone as educators, as researchers. We can't do it alone as individual business leaders who might think they've got a set of creative ideas. We can't do it alone as government policymakers, and we can't do it alone as labor leaders. But we need to bring these communities together to engage in a dialogue on how to do this. We're studying right now the future of trucking and autonomous vehicles. And what you see is the truck drivers don't think it's going to happen in their lifetime. It might happen, but I'll be out of here. Or they don't believe they can be replaced. You see the vendors saying, we're going to develop the Uber or this other technology and we can do it, and somebody else will take care of the workforce issues. And we see the industry association throwing up its hands and saying, we've got to think about ways to do this, but we don't have any power. And we see the labor organizations in that industry basically not being engaged. We need to bring those together, and we can do that here at MIT if we use all of our resources and we guide it through research. The ideas that I'm laying out here are ideas. They should be treated as hypotheses more than as conclusions, but I think they would provide a framework for us to make a real contribution. And the kinds of trends that Andy accurately played out for us, they will play out in the future if we are passive, if we don't take responsibility for these issues and start to address them. I think we can create a better future. We can create a better future by having better institutions, by having better public policies, by listening to the workforce and empowering the workforce to participate in this process with the inventors of the next generation of technologies. Thank you.
here so that I can look at, oh, I'm going to try and look at my, oh, I'm sorry, I just. So as Tom, sorry, let's see, there we go. As Tom explained, and I'm going to follow up, MIT has taken, I think, the bold step of setting up a new initiative around the work of the future. And you might ask, you know, why? We have had so much great work going on campus. We continue to be leaders, both Andy and Erik's center, Tom's center, David Otter's work, CSAIL, so many different places on campus that are touching this work. What more can be done, you know, with an initiative here at MIT? And I think the goal of the initiative is that if we can bring all of this work into a shared conversation or into a collective, connected form of opinions, can we have even a greater impact? Can we actually bring even more to bear to this important question for society? So the MIT Work of the Future initiative was launched just a couple months ago. I want to emphasize that it is the work of the future, not to be confused with the future of work, in part because we're asserting that there will be work in the future. And when people talk about the future of work, there's almost often a question mark at the end of that, is that, you know, will there be work? In fact, as Andy said, we believe there will be work. And so while this is a task force of about 20 plus faculty, in fact, there are many, many people working on this topic across the Institute, and we hope to engage all of them in various ways in this 2.5, 3 year initiative. Now, let me just briefly put, if I can, the 4 pillars that we're discussing as part of this initiative. And I can say this is a work in progress. We have not yet actually convened as a group, and so here's an attempt to try and think about what matters and where is MIT's contribution. The first is around, what, largely speaking, learning skills, education and training, the many different ways we touch that, from cognitive science to the economics work to the labor relations work that Tom's working on. Secondly, institutions, firms, industries, and communities. We know, obviously, that institutions have a great deal to do with shaping the political economy, with our labor relations, with our markets, et cetera. We also know that there's a lot of change going on across every industry, and that understanding that is really at the crux of understanding what's happening to tasks and to jobs. So manufacturing, an important area we expect to look at, services as well, healthcare, et cetera, and communities. This is in the end about people, and the people are located in communities, in cities, in regions that are very much tied to labor markets, and we have to understand that. Third, global context and comparisons there. We really believe that to understand what's going on, we have to have a global perspective here at MIT. We have to understand the difference, how technologies are adopted and how labor markets are responding, and institutions as well. From countries, from Europe, obviously a lot to learn, from some of the developing world, from China, et cetera, that we're going to try and have a global perspective on this. And finally, as Tom pointed out, the whole shaping technology, and how can we do that, how do we do that today in very conscious or subconscious ways? How can we understand from the engineering going on at MIT, right down to introducing new technologies into firms, what is the relationship with the end user? Where are the opportunities for shaping that direction? So that's a broad perspective on this new initiative, and we look forward to conversations, I think, with many people in the community, and helping catalyze more activity and communication on campus. I'm going to take a little bit of a detour, or maybe get down on the shop floor, which I always find helpful when we're having these discussions where we have a lot of data and a lot of important trends going on. And I want to just take a moment and make this a bit of a local conversation and talk about a case study here in Massachusetts. We've been out talking to a number of manufacturing firms, small and medium-sized firms, particularly those who are distributing some of this new automation and some of this technology. And as everyone knows, I think manufacturing, despite the fact that we are We've been losing jobs over a significant period of time, 6 million of them actually since about 2000. It's still an incredibly important part of our economy. And it not only represents increasing output, but the largest sector in our economy, largest R&D investment, huge multiplier effects. And so we're very interested in understanding this area almost as a critical case. I mean, we know manufacturing on the front lines of some of this automation. It started happening decades ago with the automotive industry. What do we see happening today? So I just wanted to talk briefly about a firm here in Massachusetts, in Sudbury, that's involved in precision engineering. It is a distributor of precision engineering machine tools as well as robotics, founded in about 1960. So it's been around for a long time, and it's been part of this transition toward automation since that time. It works closely with clients across the country. It's got about 300 employees, and it manufactures, it sells the machines and robotics in multiple industries: aerospace, automotive, medical device, a whole host of different areas. And historically, the robotics piece has really been dominated by the automotive industry. We know that the automotive industry has really been the bulk of our robotics adoption in this country for decades. But in the last 10 years, and part of this technology that Andy was talking about, we've seen a dramatic ability to make robotics more flexible, more affordable, and perhaps in the now in the realm of more of the small and medium-sized firm opportunity. For the longest time, these firms felt they could not get a return on investment unless they had large-scale production. But when you now have a cobot that costs you $50,000 to $80,000 and it moves from left to right and you can move it easily around the shop floor, then you actually have an opportunity to bring this into your firm. And so I just wanted to, I think that in this one case, we have a little bit of a microcosm of what's going on. In this one firm, we met Bob, who oversees the automation side of the business. He's been there for 30 years. He graduated with a degree from the Blackstone Vocational School in Upton about 30 years ago. And he's been overseeing the robotics since he's been there for 30 years. And as this technology changed over time, Bob thought, well, he's got some opportunity here to sell more robots to his small and medium-sized firms. So about 10 years ago, he hired an engineer right out of Wentworth Institute. And he said he realized in about a week that this kid knew more than he did about robotics, and that was a good thing, and that he should, perhaps give him opportunities to start developing the robotics business. Over time, he figured out there was enormous amounts that they could do here. They could figure out ways to bring the machine tooling and the robotics together. He hired another 10 engineers. And today, in this firm, they have what you would call an R&D center of these young graduates from WPI or UMass Lowell, et cetera, who are all figuring out how to customize the robotics to their customer base, figuring out how to grow into new markets, and really developing an R&D capacity that this small firm did not have 10 years ago. At the same time, they're expanding their machinists. They need more from the vocational schools to help oversee and maintain the equipment. And finally, they also see the robotics replacing some of their operators. They see them replacing anybody who's involved in moving objects from point A to B repetitively, ultimately is most likely to be replaced. In small firms, maybe they're going to be redeployed, but that's essentially a job that the robots are now taking over. So what do we understand from this? First, this is an example where this technology is bringing tremendous innovation. Here's a small firm that now has 10 engineers when it had none 10 years ago. So now there's a real opportunity for inventing with these new tools and these new capabilities. Second, they're experiencing growth. They're seeing a whole new area of markets that they can expand to. They're seeing ways in which they can now provide customization to new customers, to old and new customers. And so the firm is actually growing and hiring significantly over time. Third, we have upskilling. We have the ways in which, not only from an engineering point of view, but also from the machinist point of view. So from the workers across most of the firm, there are different ways in which they're learning learning new skills and bringing those to the fore. And finally, we have replacement. We have jobs that really are going to be replaced by this technology if they haven't been already. They're a relatively small percentage of the jobs, but nevertheless, they are being replaced. And I think in that microcosm, we have all of the dynamics of what's going on with a lot of this technology. Just some data from a colleague of ours, Sue Helper from Case Western, which just confirms a survey that she did with over 6,000 automotive supplier managers who see a tremendous amount, about 60% of them say absolutely there's very complementary work, opportunities with this technology, but another 20% saying we also see replacement going on, and we expect that to be occurring, I think, and increasing over time. But what we also know about this technology is that it's becoming more accessible. It's becoming democratized, if you will, machine learning, as well as the robotics, finding ways in which what used to take hours and hours to program is now able to program in 1 to 2 hours, and it's programmable by the technician who is learning very quickly how to work kind of with the interface of the technology. The routinized work is, on the other hand, something that we know has got real challenges in terms of replacing workers, and Tom has talked about that. What we found in our interviews is that some of the most vulnerable workers tend to be temporary workers for whom there's very high turnover, and they're usually doing some of this very routinized work. Seasonal workers, again, where you can't find the stability, the firm is looking for more stability in terms of their workforce. And there's also, there's some real, I'd say, current challenges. We spoke with one firm that had a labor force that was from undocumented workers. And as soon as there's an event, ICE shows up or something like that, that labor force disappears. And the automation becomes an answer to that instability for the firm. A little disconcerting, actually. So in any case, this is, I think, a lot of what we see on the ground about the opportunities as well as the challenges, the ways in which this is helping a lot of workers in society, the ways in which it's putting at risk a lot of the livelihood and stability for other workers. I just want to conclude with what I call things we know to be true. I find, as I think we all know, there's a lot of work going on in this space. There are a lot of predictions. There are a lot of assumptions. And so I just want to walk through a few things that, to close, that we know to be true. The first, as I said before, is that we know there will be work in the future. And the question is really, what does that work look like? Who has access to the work? Is that work quality work? And those are the questions I think we really need to focus on. The middle-skilled jobs that are in decline that Andy talked about, critically important and a trend we know is happening. Increasing income inequality, something that's been going on for decades, something that's been exacerbated by this technology, but something that's not just about technology and globalization. I think we have to acknowledge also policy that has played a role here. Likewise, the fact that labor's share of national income is declining relative to capital. An important trend that's been going on for a while, something that we have to acknowledge is got a lot of forces behind it. Finally, or close to final, I want to say that this is a global phenomenon. All of these trends are happening in countries around the world, both the developed countries as well as the developing countries. And so we have to understand this as a global phenomenon. It is not something that is just unique to this country or certainly to Western Europe. But finally, what we also know is that different countries are responding to this experience and this transition differently. So in a recent poll, when the Swedes were asked, what do you think about the future of AI and robotics, 80% said they look forward to these transitions that are going to actually improve their lives. When asked the same question in the US, 70% of respondents said they're worried about a future with AI and robotics. And I think in those distinctions, we have to find a way that says, how do we move the pendulum, certainly in this country, to the other side? How do we find a way to actually make technology work for us and reduce some of the fear and anxiety that we see in the country today? And I believe that that is something where we as a community at MIT can contribute to that discussion, and I think that it's also imperative that we lead in this area as well. Thank you very much.
So my remit today is, aside from moderating the discussion in just a minute, is to take just a few minutes to try to bring out some of the philosophical and ethical dimensions of the discussion, and maybe some of the dimensions that haven't been mentioned yet. So I'll try to do that by way of 3 questions, open-ended questions that I'll just put on the table and invite the speakers to address any or all of, and then we'll open it up. So the 3 questions are about, first one is about the transformation of work, that's to say the activity of work. The second one is about sharing the gains from technological transformation, and the third is about our role as scholars, scientists, and engineers. So a common theme stressed in each of your remarks was that while technology can eliminate jobs, just as often it's going to transform their character, transform the character of the tasks that are performed and expected of workers, how those tasks are performed, in what circumstances, and so on. It seems to me that this observation raises an important question about the criteria that we should use to think about the coming changes to the tasks. So at one end of the spectrum, technology could transform jobs by automating routine, physically difficult, or boring tasks and free the worker up to engage in creative or social activity. At the other end of the spectrum, however, we've in some cases learned that technology can transform jobs by creating the possibility for human-machine interactions that are much less happy. For example, new technologies can provide means for more effective monitoring and real-time surveillance of the employee down to the minute, detailed guidance in the form of scripts that the operator is to follow, and technology can in this way even make the work process more efficient by eliminating the room for human error, by eliminating the room for human judgment, or at least constraining it. So to my mind, that raises an important question. For purposes of discussions like this, how should we understand the notion of good work once we go beyond simply the important but limited criterion of an adequate income? What should we be on the lookout for as far as changes to the intrinsic character of work that are coming because of technological change? And connected to this, maybe a sub-question, if it's correct to say that the transformations in the character of work are principally driven by, or in large part driven by, the needs of businesses, do we have some reason to worry that concerns about the intrinsic character of the work that people are going to be asked to do in the future will fall by the wayside, and that the requirements of productive efficiency will rule the day? Or do you see developments not to worry about that as much? So more briefly, second question about sharing the gains. Myself, thinking about the issue, I've been led to wonder recently whether questions about how the gains from technological improvement, development, and automation should be shared don't depend on asking more wider questions about the purpose of work. So just to put the point very briefly, when important tasks and whole job categories are automated away, that generally heralds productivity improvements. But when societies undergo productivity improvements, at the level of the society, they face a choice. They could allocate the benefits of those productivity gains to further production and consumption of goods and services, or they could take some, not all, but some of those gains to enable people to take more time away from work. And so we saw a slide that indicated declining labor force participation, but there's a question to be asked. To what extent should declining labor force participation, or perhaps work sharing, reduction of the standard work week, and perhaps additional time away from work in other ways, subsidizing currently unsubsidized or unremunerated work, be part of the policy response? And the third question about our role as scholars, scientists, and engineers: automation and technological change is occurring in a wider political economy. Just to take one example, typically processes are automated away and technology replaces human beings when it's cost effective to do so, but that depends not merely on the capital costs, but also on what kind of work, wage workers are desperate enough to have to accept. So that will depend on the level of the, so to speak, the social wage that's available, whether people can sneak onto the disability rolls, for example, what the other income supports are, and so on. we could proliferate examples. Given that technological change and automation and its impact on employment happens in a much wider political economy of work, what do you see as the most important obstacles to putting in place policies along either of the dimensions that I just mentioned about the intrinsic character of work or allowing people to take time away from work, and where perhaps do you see the most important opportunities, given that it's a system of systems and there's only so much any one of us can do. So with that, I'll just give each of you an opportunity to say whatever you'd like in response to any of these three questions, and then I'll field some questions from the audience.
Well, let me start on this, because I think the three are very interrelated, and I have a common answer, and that is we have to strengthen the institutions that helped create a social contract in the post-war time period that had a better sharing of wages and productivity growth. I violated one of my wife's principles. She says there's a graph that you can never leave home without because you seem to use it all the time. We didn't put it up, but any one of us could have, where you show that wages and productivity moved together from the mid-40s until about just before 1980 or around 1980. Then productivity continues to grow at a reasonable rate, wages flatline. Well, that wasn't a product just of technological change, and it wasn't just globalization. Yes, those forces had an effect, but it was also the decline in the institutions. We let the minimum wage slide and decline over that time period. Unions have been destroyed in this country in the private sector. They're down to 6%. Where did that post-war social contract come from? It came from a bargain between General Motors and the UAW in about the late 1940s, when they said, we're going to have a wage formula that says we'll increase wages by aggregate growth in productivity plus cost of living, so that as the economy gets better, the real standards of living will grow. Well, we don't have a policy environment or an institutional environment that allows that same principle to play out today. We've got to rethink the fact that we have destroyed workers' voice in this country. Now, that doesn't mean bringing unions back in the mirror image. There were a lot of problems with the way in which some unions operated, but collective bargaining worked well when we had a more closed economy. So we've got to invent some new forms, and we have to help the existing labor movement to adapt. The good news is that's happening, small scale in very innovative ways. The AFL-CIO now is its own future of work group that some of us will participate in to help bring some new ideas on how we rebuild those institutions. But public policy has a critical role in setting those wage norms. Policy could play a big role in helping to restore workers' rights to organize in constructive ways, to invest in training so that there's a more continuous process, and maybe create incentives for firms, and to bring the community institutions together that Liz talked about with industry, so that there is common training credentials being developed, and that we rebuild our apprenticeship programs. Those are all actions that are doable. I just finished teaching a course, one of our online courses, and with a parallel course in the Sloan School, on shaping the future of work and building a new social contract. Well, we need to get these parties engaged in the dialogue that our students had, where they create a new social contract that gives us some promise for doing that. We don't have the political will at the moment. We have lots of political anger in this country. We've got to have a message for the people who have been left behind and the people who are helping to shape the technologies, that if we don't start engaging each other and working effectively across the lines that Liz mentioned, then we're going to have more chaos in the future. So I think we've got to rebuild our institutions. And too often when that is said, people immediately go just to training and skills. That's a necessary condition. That's far from a sufficient condition. So let's reach out and let's bring the diverse groups in society that have been left behind, or the institutions that need to play a role to empower the workforce, to make sure that the worker voice is brought in a constructive way and that they've got the knowledge and skills to make a contribution. And I think we will see some change. But if we don't do those things, if we just stay on the course we're on, we'll get a continuation of the trend lines that Andy laid out, and a continuation of this growing gap between wages and productivity growth.
Well, I couldn't agree more with the idea of trying to strengthen broadly speaking, the social contract. I mean, when we think about what I think we have to acknowledge in the face of these trends that have been consistent is actually the enormous change that's taken place in terms of the business community and models for business and new platform firms and things that have happened in terms of what work looks like now. And the fact that the workforce is also looking for a lot of these types of changes, right? One of the diversity, on one hand, we have a gig economy that's terrible for people, and on the other hand, we have a gig economy that's great for people. You know, both sides exist at the same time. One of the interesting things is having these conversations with these small and medium-sized firms, and all they can do is complain about the millennials. The first question the millennial wants is, you know, do I have flexibility and how much vacation do I have? Or, you know, there's always you've got to take this with a grain of salt, but that we've got a different generational approach to work and an understanding toward technology as well, I think, that we have to acknowledge. And have a system that allows for that flexibility, but also provides the healthcare benefits, for example, you know, that helps allow for that, because I don't think we're going to, we're not going back. We're going forward towards new models and towards a whole host of things where we see companies, to Lucas's question, companies pushing the envelope on privacy issues, on flexibility in wages. So we have Facebook, we have Uber, et cetera, and then some pushback. And I think that we're in the midst of this transition of figuring out exactly where the public is comfortable and where the companies are going to have to accommodate. And then the final point, just to follow up on what Tom was saying, was I wonder to what extent we would be having so much attention and so much concern about this if we hadn't had a real political shock to the system, which said the people who do feel left behind, the people who can't see themselves in this future, actually have a political voice, and they're exercising their political voice. And lo and behold, there's a lot of people paying attention. And I think that's an opportunity for us to grab onto that and to do something with that. And I look at what we've done with what's happened to manufacturing over the last 40 plus years. We've sort of watched that happen, with concern and with assistance, et cetera, but not with any concerted effort to respond. And it was sort of under the Obama administration, and it continues under the Trump administration. We've had an active response to say, you know what, it's not okay to lose our entire manufacturing base. We have to do something about this. And so we've responded. It's been late, but we've responded. And I hope that we're in a place here where we're actually anticipating something, and we're going to be responding in even greater force.
Let me try to say, I agree with a lot of what I just heard, but let me try to say a couple different things. The first one is that we are not going to be able to legislate the American middle class back into existence. That's just not a path that's going to work. And if we try to go back to the environment and the institutions that we had in the post-war decades, where we grew that middle class, we'll fail miserably and we will fall behind. This country is never again going to have a large, stable, prosperous middle class doing industrial-era routine jobs and routine tasks. Those jobs and tasks have gone to Shenzhen and Bangalore, and increasingly to hardware and software. So if we were to somehow strengthen the labor movement and get a $20 an hour floor for routine service jobs, that would bring forward the day when we automated those service jobs very, very quickly. So I just want to be sure that we don't reach for some tools that are comforting because they seem to have worked in the past. That past is gone forever. And the problems that actually make me scratch my head, to emphasize what my co-panelists have said, are what are the right set of policies and what are the right set of institutions, and what does a safety net look like for this world that we're creating? Because trying to hammer our world back into what it was in 1972 is going to be a recipe for economic and societal disaster. So to try to make that a little bit more concrete, the gig economy is a large and growing thing. And I spend a lot of time talking with people who think it's a large, growing, and bad thing. I'm really not so sure. A lot of people who are working those gig jobs, when you talk to them, when you look at what they say, they value the flexibility greatly as opposed to being at the whim of an employer. And when I hear about the problems with gig economy work, my first question is always compared to what? So there are a lot of reasons that driving for Lyft or Uber might not be great. The comparison there for me is probably a taxi driver, which, as far as we can tell, was not a better paid job, was not a more secure job, and you were at the whim of the person that owned the taxi or owned the medallion. So I kind of find myself saying, when I look at what these jobs are actually being compared to, what the right comparison is, I kind of find myself saying, bring on the gig economy. Now, the problems, and we've heard a little bit about this, are that those jobs don't typically have overtime pay, they don't have paid family leave, they don't have health insurance. Those are actual real challenges. But instead of just demonizing the gig economy, I think we should be thinking about what does a safety net and what does a set of bargains look like that allow that to continue to grow. Because it is going to continue to grow. We could legislate it out of existence. Again, that would be a phenomenally stupid thing to do. So it's going to continue to grow. What's the right set of reactions look like? I want to try to touch on a couple of the excellent questions you raised. You brought up that the character of work really is changing in a couple pretty fundamental ways. And I like the two that you highlighted. One is the greater degree of monitoring that we can engage in. And that sounds kind of scary. But I'm not so sure. The cash register was the first great employee monitoring technology. And I don't find that draconian or Orwellian at all. Theft went down very, very quickly. And I don't think cashiers suffered greatly as a result of the cash register. And you bring up the point that we have more and more precise monitoring technologies. I find myself largely unbothered by that as long as they're used to make sure people are doing the job that they're supposed to be doing. So, for example, should snowplows in Massachusetts have GPS monitors on them? I want to be really clear about this. Hell yes, they should have GPS monitors on them, right? Those are our tax dollars at work, and if somebody's taking a 4-hour nap when they should be plowing streets, I really want to know about that. For me, where it gets weird is if we use the precise monitoring that we have to drive employees too harshly, or to just be too stern a taskmaster. You don't need monitoring technology to do that. You can be as big a jerk as an employer as you want without any monitoring technology at all. And I do see evidence that we're kind of ratcheting up the minute-by-minute expectations on people, and I do believe monitoring helps with that. Monitoring is not the culprit there. It's kind of an over-relentless drive for more and more output that I think is the problem there. You bring up the other excellent point that we are relying less and less on human judgment in a lot of different jobs and tasks these days. The more I learn about human judgment, the more I think that's an extremely positive development, right? Our judgment is real. Our brains are amazing things. Our judgment, this is what Danny Kahneman got his Nobel Prize for. So read Thinking Fast and Slow if you want an education on this. Our judgment is incredibly flawed, biased, buggy, inconsistent, just alterable by everything from what we had for breakfast to what the weather is like outside. Good God, if we have a more objective alternative to that, why would we rely on human judgment for these things? Just to make the decision makers feel good about themselves seems like a terrible idea to me. So I honestly find this world of more evidence and more objective decision making. That's how I'd phrase it, as opposed to more monitoring and less human judgment. I kind of want that world. The decisions that we make are consequential, and we should be making them as best possible. That for me, that doesn't mean no role for human judgment, but it might mean that our judgment takes a back seat in a lot of areas. As uncomfortable as that might be to us, the comfort of the decision maker to me is really secondary to the quality of the decision. And I guess we could have an argument about that.
Great.
I just want to respond to one thing that Andy said. I want to make it very clear that it's not a debate about going back to old institutions. Nobody believes that anymore, that thinks about this. That there are some aspects of institutions that we should learn from, but we've got to adapt them to the current economy. But we're not going to get there without a more active government policy and a more forward-looking government policy on how we structure employment and related issues. And the fact that we have destroyed the existing labor movement doesn't mean that we are going to see this go forward in a vacuum. We are going to see that vacuum filled at some point. And if we don't take actions now to help the existing labor movement adjust and adapt, and the best leaders in the labor movement that I know are thinking about how to adapt, they need to have the supports of policy and education institutions to do so, to train the workforce on the skills of the future, and to have an opportunity to have a voice at work. And the workforce itself wants a voice on these issues in constructive ways, because they are prepared to help technology come into their organizations to augment their work and to make it safer and make it more productive. But I don't want to get into a debate about going back. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. Let's invent the institutional arrangements of the future that will get us where we want to go and empower workers to have a voice on monitoring, so that you get sensible monitoring, not the kind of management control monitoring.
Now, Tom, I actually disagree with that. The snowplow drivers in Massachusetts did not want the GPSs on their vehicles.
Well, but that's an engagement. Then you engage them. You don't leave it to just one stakeholder. I've studied some of the monitoring mechanisms, and you see positive and you see negative. And where you see positive ones, it's where the mechanisms for monitoring are used to improve the job performance. And if the snowplowers, it may take some hard negotiations with some groups, as we're seeing with the police at the moment, the same thing. That wasn't created in a vacuum. So we've got to change that. But you aren't going to change it by fiat without getting people more resistant. You change it by negotiating. I spent a lot of my time mediating labor and management. And that's a process where you listen and you don't take the status quo as acceptable, but you don't just try to run roughshod over one group or the other. You engage them and you move them in a positive direction.
Question from the gentleman in the white shirt.
The initial slides that Amy showed, perhaps, if you were to include the level of educational attainment over time, without being disrupted by technology, what would that have looked like? And can you speculate, assuming that that curve goes up, jobs that involve a higher level of educational attainment are being replaced by machines? What's the dynamic there?
The U.S. workforce has become progressively more educated over time. So the percentage of people that haven't finished high school, it keeps going down. We're still not majority college educated, but the percentage of people in those lower education brackets keeps going down over time. And I'm sorry, what was your second question?
But you would guess, we're talking, as you just said, a majority of the jobs that are being lost are for folks who didn't graduate from high school, right? Something like that.
No. Absolutely. So that's just an income range. It has nothing to do with education. Now,
the question is educational attainment.
Yeah. So
the jobs that are being replaced in the future, if we're talking about folks who have graduate training and they're being replaced, what's the dynamic in society?
Yeah, I'm not that worried about graduate students being automated away. There'll be a bit of that, but people with college and especially postgraduate educations have very, very low unemployment rates, and they seem to be the ones that can jump around from job to job if one goes away. I think I hear what you're saying. It's definitely the case that those jobs that are being created down at the lower end of the middle class, those are typically jobs that go to people with less education and less formal training. But you know, there will be some financial planners automated out of existence. I think they're going to be okay.
Yeah, the fastest area, job occupations that are growing are those that need a BA right now, right? So that's kind of where the economy is going.
Gentleman in the hat.
Hi, I give a lecture at Harvard about biologically inspired cybernetics, which is relevant to evaluate complex systems such as healthcare. So the question that I have for you is, in the context of AI, and as we move forward towards a fusion of the digital, the physical, and the biological worlds, what new frameworks should we develop from cybernetics or other fields in order to help us understand and support these emerging hybrid societies that are going to develop?
If you look at where the greatest job growth and greatest income growth is coming today, it's in jobs that have hybrid, what are some people call hybrid skills. Certainly analytical, technical skills, not necessarily deep design, and you know, certainly that's useful, but the ability to use technology, to understand it, to manipulate it, and to use data in a reasonable way, along with the skills to communicate, to solve problems, to work together in teams. That both of those sets of skills are rising in importance, and when you bring them together, you are creating jobs that really will support, because they're very productive, because they make the technology work. We see this in healthcare in the best organizations. And what you see is, again, it goes back to this task structure. So what the designers, the cybernetics people need to understand is there's flexibility in how you organize the work. So if you think about a clinic today, you're seeing a lot of movement of the work that physicians used to do and nurse practitioners used to do, delegated to the medical assistants, if those medical assistants are trained and educated in how to deal with patients, how to do more of the tasks that are routine, and it frees up the physicians to use AI more quickly, to use the information. It frees up the nurses and the nurse practitioners to do more high-skill work, because there is a shortage of primary care workers, or primary care physicians. And so when you get them working as a team, you can think about how to redistribute the tasks that used to be bifurcated in very narrow ways. And you see this happening at places like Kaiser Permanente, you see it at Duke University hospitals, you see it on a number of different very thoughtful clinics where they're reorganizing the work. But that means they've got to have the technology designers provide the interfaces and provide the right mix of tools so that the users can really make them pay off. So the cybernetics, the designers need to learn more about how work is done. They're going to need to spend more time with the people who are doing it, from the physicians to the nurses. And then they need to see how can they augment their work so that the technology really can be utilized most effectively. That's the marriage of these groups, so that you bring them together, and I think you get the best possible productivity outcomes, and you get augmented work, because some of the people who were just doing routine jobs now can be upskilled, and some of the people who were doing those middle-skilled jobs can be doing a more wider variety of both physical healthcare and social behavioral kind of healthcare. That's where the best of medical care is going today.
Ken Oy from Political Science at MIT. I want to actually ask a question based on Elisabeth's last bullet point on her last slide. And since you're looking this way, it says, different countries are experiencing this transition differently. Question is, can you identify countries that you think are handling it well or badly? in terms of outcomes? And if you find good examples, why are they doing better, or bad examples, why are they doing worse? Tom, you were arguing policies that should be followed, seizing command of our destiny. To what extent is that possible, or does it require serious adjustments in structures, open economy assumptions, and the like? Andrew, you were actually suggesting more of a convergence approach. There was a certain regularity that you were observing across countries. To what extent is our fate in our hands, or in fact, is there congruence, convergence? And Elisabeth, you're the person that posed the question, so I'd really like your comments on your two colleagues.
Can I respond? We're going to study that. We think that's an important question. Probably not, but I think we will on that point. I have one of the quotes that came from the Swedish example was something where they said, you know, we don't protect jobs, we protect workers, right? That's kind of the fundamental focus there. And I think, you know, obviously from our comparative political science friends, we understand that the institutions are very different. How many times have we turned to Germany and said, oh, that apprenticeship model, we should really learn from it? And I think we are learning from it. But clearly, I mean, I think that Germany has been at the forefront of this, obviously. They have coined the term Industry 4.0 for the rest of us to use, and at the same time figuring out how to work with the labor force, with the unions, et cetera, to find ways to really adapt the workforce. And I think it has a lot to do with their training system. So there's no question we see examples of success. Examples where they're not so successful, I don't feel like I have a window on that. What we do know also from China is that the word is, you know, automate, 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 and we're not sure what is happening to those workers, but we know that that's the government's policy right now. In terms of convergence or not, I mean, again, I think that is a question of whether we have the kind of political and economic and other wills that come together, certainly in this country, because it is entirely possible that we could continue in these trends, you know, that we see now. But I think I think there are political, obviously economic and political consequences. So in some ways, my thought is that we're actually going to see more convergence or more ability moving toward models that we know have worked elsewhere. Now, having said that, it's interesting to watch these universal basic income policies and experiments happening around from Finland to Canada to this country, and you know, various responses to that. So that'll be interesting to see how that gets taken up. You want to say something?
Yeah, the technological trends are more similar than different around the world. So for example, if you look at almost all the OECD countries, you see that the market share of jobs has been moving around in the way that I showed for America. So market share of middle-class jobs is going away almost across the board in wealthy North American and European countries. The differences to me are sharper though, and the differences are in how countries react to these technological tides. And what I respect about the Scandinavian, the Northern European, German-speaking countries is not so much what they did, is that they decided to come together and make some pretty big changes to their legal environment, their policy environment, their safety nets, and they were able to come together and do some smart moves. My point is that not that we need to try to copy them exactly. I think you're right. I don't think that'll work very well. But my real concern is that we seem to have lost the ability to come together in America and agree that something needs to get done, and we should figure out what that is. So the fact that that our political parties just seem to want to yell at each other and we can't get together to get anything done is really, really scary to me at a time of this much change. My frustration is that we used to be kind of the best at that. The last time there was a tech surge this big, the US led the way and put in place universal mandatory free primary education. It was a crazy idea at the time, best idea of the 20th century, and now we're surrendering that lead about doing bold things as a country in the face of these big changes.
Well, I think I would say it's not so much a favorite country. The institutions of Northern Europe, of Germany, and what they are doing is adaptable to the United States. And that is, as Liz said, in Germany, IG Metall, which is the metal workers union, has negotiated an agreement to work together with the German manufacturing industry, particularly the auto industry, but it's broadening out, to say how are we going to adapt our apprenticeship systems to more lifelong learning, which is not one of their strengths. So they're making incremental adjustments, and in some cases substantial ones, and they know they don't have all the solutions, but they are engaged. And Andy's absolutely right. We have lost our ability to engage across these lines. And so, yes, the reason the Swedes are not afraid of technology is they do have a stronger safety net, and they are not protecting jobs. They are adjusting the workforce, and they're going with where the job opportunities are, because there's more portability of benefits. So if we're going to move to more gig-like structures, then we've got to have the benefit portability and those adjustments in policy that go along with it. We can do it. We've got to recognize we start from a different base. We start with different institutions, but we know what directions we need to go, and it's a matter of bringing the political will and the parties together.
Do the panelists agree that attacking or destroying the safety net in the United States may not be ideal in managing transitions?
Agreed.
I think we could stipulate that, but let's adapt it. We don't want, we can't have individual employers bearing the burden of health insurance. That may have worked in the 1940s when it was invented in this country, because you had stable big firms and so on and long-term employment relations, but now we have got a mess.
Yeah,
and we're only halfway to reforming our healthcare system.
And to make that even more concrete, the earned income tax credit is a great intervention. The research is really strong that it works. It does exactly what it's designed to do. It encourages work. It encourages participation. It helps families' incomes. Both Paul Ryan and Barack Obama publicly said things in favor of it. Have we expanded the EITC? No. Just this logjam is just so vexing.
Good time for one more.
Okay, I guess I'll end on a big note. The symposium's title, the most important word in that title, I hope you all agree, is human, or humans. And we've been talking a lot about the sort of business elements, the political and business elements of this, but we haven't talked a lot about the human elements of it. And I think that needs to be brought into the discussion, in all of the discussions around technology. And I think it's crucial that it's brought in the most effective way, which is on both the philosophical level, which is above and beyond the political level, and also on the personal level, which not everyone gets to participate in this kind of discussion. It's a very siloed discussion for the most part. So I think if there's any possible way that we can introduce the question of what do we want as a humanity? What do humans want? What is our purpose? Why do we invent this technology? And then go from there and ask the philosophical questions and ask the personal questions about this stuff. Because we've already heard from the political and the business level. So
These are indeed a very large question, so we'll hand it over to the speakers for final comments, and I think we'll wrap it up.
That's why I challenged the title of this symposium. We need humans to take charge of the technology. And I don't mean that in a hostile way. I mean exactly the way you articulated it. In this online course that I teach, I ask participants, what's your most important priority for work? The answer for 4 years now has been, I want to address big problems in society. yes, I want a decent income, that comes in there too. And yes, I want a work-life balance, that comes in, so on. But it's, people really want to work with these issues. They want to make a contribution, and they want to be informed, and they want to have a voice. And if we follow those basic principles and enable them in new ways, in very flexible ways, and not in just the existing institutions, but provide those opportunities, I think they will help inform the problems that we can use technology to solve, and they will inform how we can invent new applications for these technologies. That's what I see in healthcare. My wife is a nurse practitioner, and she's been out there using technologies in the community, serving chronic care populations. And they have found new ways to link the different social workers, transportation people, medical care, physicians, the pharmacies, and they are the systems integrators. And they are using technology in ways that the technologists never imagined. That's the power, because they have a voice in how they can shape it and change it and use it and integrate with both social skills and good technical nursing and healthcare skills. If we just empower people to do that, we will get better outcomes and we'll get more meaningful work that keeps people motivated to get up every day.
Well, it's a wonderful question, and thank you for asking it. And I think you're right that we need to bring this back to the human element and also to the philosophical. What is work to all of us? Just a couple maybe anecdotes. The first is, perhaps you're familiar with this this example or this experiment in Kentucky with trying to teach coal miners coding, how to transition into the digital economy, and MIT's been somewhat involved, and it's a wonderful program that's gotten some attention and some traction. But what I found very powerful about the effort was this sense that people did not feel they could see themselves in the future. They did not know how to move from coal mining to coding, and it's not that it's an easy thing to do, but the point is we need to give people an opportunity to see themselves in this future, whatever that is, and I think that's an important element of what we're trying to do here. I'll also just mention as an anecdote that when President Reif put out an op-ed in November, and then subsequently this initiative was announced, the number of responses from the MIT campus, broadly speaking, so not just the faculty and things like that, but from staff and from others who wanted to say, I'm really glad that you're going to do this. This is very important. I want to contribute. It affects everybody. It doesn't matter what part of the MIT community one works in. You see that this is an important issue for everyone, and that we have to keep in mind as we do this work.
I think this is a nice question and an appropriately kind of broad one to end on. So when I think about what do we want as human beings, let me try to suggest a really uncontroversial list. We'd like to live longer and healthier lives. We would like to have work that is less characterized by drudgery and toil and pain. We'd probably like to have more hours in the week that are not spent working so that we can pursue other interests. We'd probably like to have access to more of the world's accumulated knowledge and wisdom and the ability to contribute to that. We'd probably want to live in a cleaner environment as opposed to a dirtier one. And we would probably like to be able to take better care of some of the most wretched people on the earth and lift them up from the absolute base of the pyramid and give them better lives. We're making faster progress on all of those things than has ever before been the case in human history. That is not despite technology, that is in large part because of technology. So if we think about what we want as humans, or how can we best help humanity, we should all be strong cheerleaders for technological progress.
Thank you very much for such a rich and lively conversation, for all the questions that you brought. I think Herb's spirit was with us tonight. Thank you. Good night.